Now, the COVID-19 pandemic, what's called the migration crisis, terrorism, Brexit, tensions between the US and Mexico, conflicts around the world, they all have one thing in common. It's borders. Borders that can be physical or administrative, hard, fluid. Our guest today has studied borders that lie around the world and the impact they have. Deputy Director of the Foundation for Strategic Research, a French think tank on defence and security issues, Mr. Bruno Tertrais. Thanks for joining us. Can I start simply by asking you, where did this interest come in studying borders to the extent that you've published a book of maps on the borders?
Well, I'm not going to go personal, but I've always been fascinated by them. Even as a teenager, I wanted to cross borders, photograph them, etc. But it doesn't matter. What matters is that international borders are actually the best key to understand pretty much each and every international issue. You know, these issues, they're not necessarily about borders themselves. Border problems are symptoms. They're not the disease. I mean, if there is a disease, it's the confrontation between states, neighbors, or distant countries. But their borders are generally the best symptoms of their relation. It's the barometer. It's the best prism to understand and study international relations.
But do you think overall borders are a good or a bad thing? Governments would say they protect, but they are pretty lethal as well.
I have a pretty clear position on this. They're neither good nor bad. Some people don't like them. Some people like them. You know, Donald Trump loves them. Militants who want the complete opening of borders dislike them. Many researchers dislike them. I don't. I neither dislike them nor like them. I study them, and I think they're neither useless nor a panacea. Walls are not a panacea. But I'm afraid to say that Mr. Trump loved his wall. He was wrong. But when he said people want to see borders, and if you don't have a border, you don't have a country, I'm afraid he was right. He was capturing something that we saw also very much during the Brexit debate, is that the need for feeling sovereign, for feeling to be your own master at home. This is also what borders are about. So it's about how you manage borders, not whether they are good or bad. Borders are necessary for a state to exist.
And then I guess the question is, should a state exist? But when we look
that's a different question.
Different debate. But when you look at the situation there of people needing to see borders, I mean, here in the EU, that one of the founding principles is this free movement of travel. And yet every time there is a crisis, terrorism or more recently COVID-19, countries, the first thing they do nearly is put back up their borders. Is that idea of the EU still something we're moving towards, do you think?
You're putting a finger on a very important point. It's the big debate. One of the big debates for the EU in the future is going to be, will the freedom of circulation, freedom of movement survive? It's now considered a fundamental principle of the European integration process. But then we've had terrorism, we've had illegal migration, and now the pandemics. On all these three issues, there's a number of reactions in governments and public opinion to say, we need to close our borders again. So facing this triple threat, so to say, will the freedom of movement be maintained? I think yes. I think yes on the medium run, because quite simply, there are too many advantages on having an open border within the EU. But there's a condition, however. I think the freedom of movement principle will survive only if the EU and the governments and the EU governments can demonstrate their people, their public opinion, that they are able to control their external border, that they are able to decide who gets in, who does not. Of course, this does not solve the humanitarian problem in the Mediterranean and elsewhere. I totally agree with that. But if we can't demonstrate to our public opinions that we can actually control our external borders, not close it, control it, which is very different, never confuse controlling and closing, then under that condition, I think freedom of movement will survive indeed.
Globally, our borders, are there more and more borders, or is it just a perception?
No, there are now, the number of borders now is quite stable. These borders are being demarcated, delineated, etc. But it's stable on land. What changes is the delimitation of borders at sea. And this is like the new frontier. You know, there's the same word.
The Arctic as well.
Yes. Well, the Arctic is also, but the Arctic is sea, it's an ocean. So that's part of the question. The French have the same word for frontier and border. So I can't use this in French, but I would say that in French, I say la mer, c'est la nouvelle frontière. The sea is the new frontier. Because now we're entering a phase where the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas is being implemented. So borders are being drawn literally now, and it's sometimes very difficult, and it is going to be increasingly the place where states confront themselves at sea.
Exactly. Conflict, because borders tend to lead to conflict.
Yes, but then again, it's not the borders which create the conflict.
It's the states.
It's the states. Borders are just the symbol or the symptom.
But most borders are designed to keep people out. And then there's just, if I understand correctly, one border that keeps people in.
Well, it's actually walls and barriers, which are designed to keep people out. That's a big difference, by the way, with the Berlin Wall. People often say, well, we're seeing the return of wars in Europe 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, but that's quite a different question, because the Berlin Wall was designed, just like the Iron Curtain in general, to keep people from leaving. And our new walls and borders, or walls and barriers, are designed to keep people from getting in, which is quite different. But fundamentally, the walls and borders don't matter. They do matter for those trying to get in, of course. But what matters is whether the openings of the border are actually accessible or not. I mean, generally these walls they are not necessarily designed to keep everybody out. They're designed to keep illegal flows.
They function with
people.
controls.
Yes, it's a control function.
Very briefly, Mr. Tertras, if I can ask you, we were looking throughout the day at that situation with China, and the Chinese ambassador in France has been summoned because of an insult to a French researcher who is, of course, someone you know well. And Claire, can you tell us a little bit your view on all of that?
Yes, I have a pretty strong view on this because Antoine Bondaz is a colleague and a friend. But I'm also the deputy director of that Foundation for Strategic Research. So my reaction, both as a colleague and as his boss, is that first of all, I'm quite glad that the French Foreign Ministry reacted strongly. We expected that reaction, but I think it's very important that it's made public. But also, I want to ensure that we are quite. We will continue our work in full freedom and independence. And certainly, the message to the Chinese ambassador, if he was sitting or standing next to me, said, "Sir, we will not be intimidated."
Okay, Mr. Tertras, thanks so much for joining us on France 24 and telling us a little bit more about the borders that are crossing our globe.
Thank you.